The sunrise cast a golden glow across the fields of Mason Carter's family farm in Redwood Valley, Montana. Perched atop his old John Deere tractor, Mason felt a familiar sense of pride as the rich soil turned beneath the plow just like it had for the past 4 generations. His grandfather had taught him how to plant before he could ride a bike, and nothing, not even the persistent buzzing of his phone, could distract him from this sacred spring ritual. His family's farm stretched across 2,000 acres, feeding thousands and anchoring their legacy since 1893. But over the past year, a new neighbor had moved in Silver Pines Estates, a luxury housing development built right up against his eastern boundary. The newcomers had fancy cars, manicured lawns, and zero appreciation for the scent of fresh manure or the sound of early morning tractors. At lunch, Mason finally checked his phone and nearly choked on his sandwich. 10 missed calls, 3 voicemails, and 1 chilling email from the Silver Pines HOA titled, "Violation Notice." The letter demanded that Mason cease all farming operations within 500 feet of their property or face fines of $200 a day. He laughed until he realized they were dead serious. The next morning, as Mason Carter sipped his coffee on the porch, the sound of car doors slamming broke the calm. A luxury black SUV pulled into his gravel driveway, kicking up dust. Out stepped a woman in a stark white pantsuit, heels sinking into the soft earth, clipboard in hand, flanked by 2 men in matching golf polos emblazoned with the Silver Pines Estates HOA logo. "Mason Carter?" she called, her voice clipped and rehearsed. "I am." "You must be lost," Mason replied coolly, setting down his mug. "I'm Victoria Langford, president of the Silver Pines HOA. We need to discuss your ongoing violations." Mason crossed his arms. "Lady, this isn't a suburb. This is a working farm. Your HOA doesn't have jurisdiction here." Victoria's smile never touched her eyes. "Actually, according to the county zoning board, your agricultural exemption expired last year. As such, your property is now subject to our community's environmental and aesthetic standards outlined under Municipal Code 47.9b. That stopped him cold. His property taxes hadn't changed. His exemption should have been valid for years. "My family's been farming this land since the 1800s, he said, his voice low. "No HOA gets to rewrite that." Victoria handed him a formal cease and desist notice, crisp and cold like her voice. "You have 48 hours to comply. Otherwise, we begin assessing fines." They turned and walked away like the matter was settled. Mason's phone rang. It was his cousin Ethan, who lived just inside Silver Pines. He sounded rattled. "They've been talking about this for months," Ethan warned. "Victoria's been holding closed-door meetings with developers. There's talk of a massive expansion project, retail, condos, the whole works." That night, Mason sat under the dim light of his kitchen, scouring the county records website. What he found made his blood run cold: a quiet land transfer filing made 6 weeks ago listing 1,700 acres of his family's farmland under the ownership of the Silver Pines Community Trust. His phone slipped from his hand. The next day, surveyors in suits showed up on his eastern field, snapping photos, driving stakes into his wheat. Mason drove his truck straight through the field, stopping inches from them. "You're on private property." A man in an Armani blazer smiled smugly. "Not according to this." He showed Mason a county-stamped map. "I'm Bryce Hammond, Westfield Development. We purchased this parcel from Silver Pines Estates last month." Mason stared at the map in disbelief. "I never sold this land." Bryce looked puzzled. "The sale went through. Fully authorized. Signed documents and all." Mason raced home, yanked open his family safe, and pulled out the original deeds. Still in his name. Still intact. Something was very, very wrong. He called the county clerk. "Yes, Mr. Carter. Our system shows you still own the main homestead and 300 surrounding acres," the clerk said. "But the remaining 1,700 were transferred under a petition filing 6 weeks ago." Mason's heart pounded. "That's impossible. I never signed anything." "Sir," she said gently, "the documents have your signature." He stared out the window and saw Victoria parked across the road, staring straight at him. And smiling. Mason Carter sat frozen in his muddy boots, heart pounding as the weight of it all crushed down on him. 1,700 acres, his family's legacy gone. Sold behind his back. And somehow a signature that looked exactly like his now graced documents he had never seen. He barely slept that night. By morning, he drove straight to the Redwood County Records office. The clerk, Mrs. Rivera, who'd known Mason since he was a boy, greeted him with a worried look. "I was going to call you," she whispered. "Something about that land transfer didn't sit right. But the paperwork came through notarized, digital stamps and all. It looked official. She pulled up the file. There it was. Black and white. The Silver Pines Community Trust had filed a petition transfer 6 weeks earlier, claiming a long-forgotten clause in a deed from the 1950s. Attached were scans of signatures, his grandfather's and Mason's. "That's not my signature," Mason said flatly. "I believe you, Mrs. Rivera replied, her voice low. "But proving it will take time." Mason drove home in a daze. His phone buzzed again, Sheriff Bill Keegan, an old friend from high school. "Buddy, I've been getting daily complaints from the HOA. Noise, dust, chicken odors. I know it's bull, but they're flooding us with filings. And there's more." Mason leaned against the barn. "Let me guess, there was a meeting?" Keegan sighed. "Closed door. County commissioners. A rep from Westfield Development. HOA leadership. Word is, this was greenlit months ago. You're the last obstacle." As if on cue, he saw strangers in hard hats stepping onto his eastern wheat field. He jumped in his truck and sped across the farm. "You're trespassing," he yelled. One of them turned, clipboard in hand. "We're with Westfield Development. We're surveying for Oakview Commons, upscale townhomes and retail." Mason's chest burned. "You have no right." "We were told the land was cleared for construction," the man replied. Mason returned home to a notice taped to his front door. A final warning from the HOA demanding he vacate all structures within the new residential footprint by the end of the month. Beneath it, a glossy flyer, "Coming soon, Oakview Commons, starting at $1.2 million. Rage welled in his throat. He tore through family records until midnight, finally unlocking an old wooden chest that had belonged to his grandfather. Inside, faded deeds, land maps, tax ledgers, and then a leather-bound folder labeled Redwood Valley Water Easement, 1943. Mason opened it. His breath caught. It detailed an agreement between the Carter family and the county. The main water control junction feeding the entire valley sat on Mason's remaining 300 acres. And by law, agricultural usage took precedence over all other claims. He grabbed his phone and called his attorney. "They stole my land through forged documents," Mason growled. "But they forgot one thing." "What's that?" the lawyer asked, groggy. Mason's voice was steel. "I control their water." Mason Carter stood at the edge of his irrigation canal, the leather-bound folder still clutched in one hand, the sunrise breaking over the distant mountains behind him. His grandfather's signature stared up from the 1943 water easement document like a ghost from the past. Water allocations must always prioritize agricultural use. All access routes, pipes, and control valves remain under Carter Homestead Authority. They thought they had one. They thought bulldozers, forged signatures, and legal loopholes could bury over a century of family legacy. They didn't realize he held the valve that controlled their million-dollar dreams. That morning, Mason called Sarah Whitaker, an old college friend turned water rights attorney. After reviewing the original easement, her voice turned sharp. "Mason, this document is gold. Your family owns the primary water access point to the valley. Silver Pines, the townhomes, the luxury development, they all rely on your infrastructure. And as long as you're actively farming, even if it's just 300 acres, you have full priority." He exhaled slowly. Then it's time they remembered where their water comes from. By noon, he filed formal notice with the Redwood County Water Authority, legally invoking his rights. The action triggered an immediate rerouting of water, every drop now flowing solely to the Carter acreage. At first, it was subtle. Residents at Silver Pines Estates noticed lower water pressure. Sprinklers sputtered. Faucets trickled. Then, nothing. Overnight, 500 homes lost access. The HOA phones lit up like wildfire. The next morning, Mason sat at his kitchen table sipping coffee, phone buzzing nonstop. Victoria Langford had called 17 times. He finally picked up. "What the hell did you do?" she snapped. "Exercised my rights," Mason said flatly. "You know, the ones tied to the 300 acres you didn't steal. You're jeopardizing an entire community." "No, Victoria," Mason corrected, "you did that when you committed fraud to steal my land." From the window, Mason watched as news vans parked outside his gate. A local reporter, Julie Ramirez, stepped out holding a microphone. "Can we speak to you about the water disruption in Silver Pines?" Mason opened the gate. "Sure," he said, holding up the original 1943 easement. "But this isn't a water story. It's about corruption, fraud, and power. And how sometimes the land fights back." Later that night, texts poured in. Developers are threatening to sue the HOA. Property values are crashing. Half the board wants Victoria out. Even neighbors who once ignored Mason now begged him to restore water. But it wasn't about water anymore. It was about respect. That evening, Victoria herself showed up on his porch, makeup smudged, voice hoarse. "Please," she whispered. "Kids, elderly, people can't shower." Mason leaned against the doorframe. Maybe they should have asked where their water came from before they tried to bury a century of history. She blinked. "What do you want?" "I want my land back. All of it." Her silence was the first honest thing she'd given him. And in that moment, the balance of power shifted. By the following morning, Silver Pines Estates was in a full-blown crisis. Mason Carter sat on his porch, watching as luxury SUVs zipped up and down the road in confusion. Emergency HOA meetings were being called. Portable water tanks were being delivered to panicked residents. The once pristine lawns were browning fast, and the development's Instagram page, usually filled with curated sunset shots, was now flooded with angry comments and tagged complaints. "No water for 3 days? We paid $1.5 million for this? Is this even legal?" It was. Mason had made sure of it. He had filed every form, documented every step. And the moment he redirected water exclusively to his land, he triggered a chain reaction that no one, especially not Victoria Langford, had prepared for. At 11 a.m., her black SUV pulled into his drive again. This time, she wasn't alone. 2 men in sharp suits stepped out behind her, Westfield Development's legal team. Victoria's voice was smoother now, desperate but polished. "Mason, we'd like to propose a compromise," she began. "This whole thing, it's gotten out of hand." "You forged deeds," Mason said, arms crossed. "Tried to erase 130 years of history. What exactly is the compromise part?" The developer rep, Miles Becker, cut in. "We didn't know the land was stolen. We were lied to by the HOA. But we're willing to make this right." "Talk," Mason said. Miles nodded. "We're prepared to return the full 1,700 acres, pending judicial approval. In exchange, we'd like to propose a joint initiative, a modern agricultural education and production center, built on a corner of the land." He pulled out a folder, plans for a community co-op, a state-of-the-art processing facility, and a farming education campus for kids from the city. It would create jobs, restore food supply chains, and even offer internships for local students. "You'd maintain full ownership and operational control," Miles added. "We'll fund construction and staff the education program." Mason raised an eyebrow. "And Silver Pines?" Victoria cleared her throat. "We'll rewrite the HOA charter. Farming zones will be protected indefinitely. No more complaints. No more interference. In fact, the board will vote to create a permanent buffer zone between the community and your land." Mason was quiet for a long moment. "Why now?" he finally asked. "Because we're losing everything," Victoria admitted. "And the only way forward is with you." He didn't smile. Not yet. But he reached out and took the folder. "I'll have my attorney review this. If it checks out, 9 a.m. Tomorrow, my kitchen table. Bring your full board, your documents, and your humility." As they left, Mason stood at the edge of his fields, watching his sprinklers arc high over rows of green. For the first time in weeks, the land felt alive again. They had tried to take it all. Now he would decide who got to stay. Mason Carter had always considered himself a simple man. A farmer, a steward of his family's land, a quiet neighbor who kept to his rows and routines. But as he sat at the head of his kitchen table the next morning, surrounded by lawyers, developers, and the freshly humbled board of the Silver Pines HOA, he realized something had shifted. He wasn't just fighting for his farm anymore. He was leading a movement. The HOA's president, Victoria Langford, looked a far cry from the crisp, untouchable figure she once was. Her voice was softer now, her posture less proud. Even the developer, Miles Becker, seemed to tread carefully, showing deference that hadn't existed just a week prior. Laid out on Mason's table were 2 things: a revised land deed returning full ownership of the 1,700 acres, a joint agreement to build the Carter Agricultural Education Center on 50 acres, fully funded, but fully controlled by Mason. He took a long sip of coffee before speaking. "Before we go further," he said, "let's make something clear. This isn't charity. This is reparation." Victoria nodded silently. "This land doesn't just grow food," Mason continued. "It grows values, hard work, community, history. You tried to bulldoze that for luxury kitchens and Instagram views." The room was silent, not with tension but with respect. "We build the center," Mason said, pointing to the plan. "We hire locally. We educate kids. And the HOA? You stay out of my fences. Permanently." The lawyer beside Victoria slid a folder forward. "We've amended the HOA bylaws. Farming within a mile radius is now fully protected. No more noise complaints. No odor citations. The board can't override it." It was all there. Signed. Stamped. Binding. Mason finally nodded. "Then let's plant something real." In the weeks that followed, the Carter farm transformed into a symbol. Not just of victory, but of unity. The sprinkler systems hissed back to life. Tractor engines hummed again. And slowly, the residents of Silver Pines began to show up, not with complaints but curiosity. Mason welcomed them on his terms. He gave guided tours of the fields to children who had never seen a tomato growing from the vine. He opened a small produce stand. He even taught a few teenagers how to operate the smallest tractor model. And the center? Construction began almost immediately. Framed in reclaimed wood from the original Carter barn, it was built with love from both local farmers and residents, many of whom had once signed petitions to shut him down. Mason had changed. He no longer saw himself as a quiet man protecting a shrinking legacy. Now he was a builder, connector, a voice, not just for his family, but for every farmer who'd ever been told their land was worth less than someone else's lawn. And as the fields of Redwood Valley swayed with new crops under his watchful eye, Mason knew one thing for certain: they would never underestimate him again. 6 months later, the once contentious land of Redwood Valley looked unrecognizable, but in the best possible way. Where bulldozers had torn into Mason Carter's wheat fields now stood rows of thriving crops, a sprawling community market, and the near-finished Carter Agricultural Education Center, a shining symbol of what happens when legacy and progress work together. The Carter farm, once at risk of erasure, was now the beating heart of the valley. That morning, Mason stood under the oak tree his great-grandfather planted, watching children from both Silver Pines and nearby towns run through the corn maze, laughter echoing through the crisp autumn air. Parents chatted over mugs of cider. Local farmers handed out pumpkins and jars of homemade jam. Even Victoria Langford had changed. She arrived quietly with her teenage daughter. No clipboard, no heels. Just a plate of apple pie and an apology. She didn't ask for anything. She simply said, "Thank you for not giving up." Mason nodded, not out of pride, but peace. The scandal had rocked the county. News outlets ran headlines for weeks. Developer fraud exposed. Farmers' water rights save community. HOA overreach sparks national legal reform. Victoria and her corrupt board faced legal consequences, and the new HOA leadership, including Mason's neighbor Tom Riley, rewrote the community charter from scratch, with input from both residents and local farmers. But what mattered most wasn't the lawsuits, the media, or the court victories. It was this: a harvest festival where people from both sides of the property line gathered together, no longer divided by fences, but connected by food, stories, and hard-won respect. Mason's wife joined him under the tree, handing him a cup of cider. "You ever imagine it'd end like this?" He shook his head. "No, I imagined losing everything." She looked out across the fields. "And now you've built more than any of us ever dreamed." Mason watched his son teaching a Silver Pines teen how to reverse a tractor trailer, both of them laughing like old friends. "That's the funny thing about land," he said quietly. "You can try to pave over it, fence it off, rezone it. But the truth is, when it holds roots, real roots, it always finds a way back." He paused, then added with a small smile, "Especially when the water's still flowing." As the sun dipped low behind the mountains and the golden light kissed the fields, Mason took one final look at what they had nearly lost, and what they had chosen, together, to rebuild. Not just a farm, not just a legacy, but a community. And for the first time in generations, the Carter family land wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. Mason Carter's journey wasn't just about saving his land. It was about reclaiming dignity, legacy, and the power of standing up when no one else will. In a world where money, influence, and flashy contracts often drown out tradition, one man with a righteous cause and the courage to fight back proved that integrity still matters. The true lesson? Even when everything seems lost, even when institutions, neighbors, or the law itself are used as weapons, you still have a voice. And sometimes that's all it takes to shift the entire balance. What began as a battle for soil became a story about community, redemption, and restoring respect for where we come from. Mason didn't win because he shouted the loudest. He won because he had the truth, the law, and generations of quiet strength behind him. And in the end, the most powerful rule of all wasn't found in bylaws or land deeds. It was this light bulb: you can't erase a legacy that's still feeding people. If you're facing unfair treatment by an HOA, a company, or even a community, don't stay silent. Start by learning your rights, documenting everything, and connecting with others who feel the same. Most systems that abuse power do so because they count on your silence. But when you speak up, armed with facts, allies, and persistence, you'd be surprised how quickly the tide can turn. Whether you're protecting land, a home, or just your dignity, remember, you are not alone. Your voice can expose lies, inspire others, and rebuild what others tried to tear down. You don't need to control the water supply to make a difference. You just need to believe that you can. Have you ever stood up to unfair treatment? Share your story in the comments. And if this inspired you, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more true justice stories.